That is the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, and what it means to give a blessing and receive a blessing. And actually, I'm going to try to explain what a blessing is, because these are such huge words that are difficult to define. So part of the journey will be stopping and defining some of these words that I find difficult only because they're so complex and such huge concepts. So first of all, the Parsha is Parshat NASSO, which literally means to lift up, and it refers to the census that is ordered at the beginning of our Parsha, the census of the descendants of Gershon. So in order to take a census, we are told that the one taking the census literally lifts up the head of each person to be counted. And in this case, the sons of Gershon, they're one of three sons of Levi. They are Leviim, and therefore, from the tribe of Leviim, they are counted the males between ages 30 to 50. That seems to be the age requirement for service in the temple. They have to do a lot of schlepping. It's a very physical job. They also have to be alert and in their prime. So we are first counting the males between ages 30 and 50. And then later on, we've got a couple interesting themes in this Parsha. We just came from Vayikra, which was all about mitzvot and all about laws and rules. Now we are in Bamidbar, and immediately we get a couple stories, a couple narratives. So we're back in this whole pleasurable story-making part of the Torah. The first story is the story of the Sotah, the wayward wife. Right after that, and in fact, this is part of what Abigail chanted, is about the story of the Nazir and the requirements of the Nazir. And in fact, the Haftorah, which we didn't summarize and which we didn't chant, but it's a familiar story to most of us, because the most famous Nazir in all of Tanakh, of course, is Samson, who was promised by his mother in return for God's promises of getting her pregnant. She gives up her son Samson for a lifetime commitment to a Nazirite vow. Now, normally a Nazirite vow is for a particular length of time with a beginning and an end, typically 30 days. This isn't the whole story of Samson in our Haftorah. It's just the story of the beginning of the Samson story. So the part of the story where the angel or the Ish comes to visit Samson's mother, we don't know her name, and she relays this episode to her husband Manoach, and then she has another visit from the angel, and the requirements for what needs to be done with the boy who's going to be born are laid out for her. So take a look at that. It's one of the fun stories to read in Tanakh. But I'm going to focus on the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, which is an exquisite part of all of Torah. 3 verses. The first verse has three words. The second verse has 5 words. The third verse has 7 words. So in these very slim 15 words, we're given literally worlds, angels, doorways into so much of what's important to us in Judaism, the idea of this exquisite blessing. So I've done my own interpretation of the Hebrew, which I want to read. You heard Abigail chant beautifully the Hebrew. The first pasuk is, "May God bless you and watch over you." The second one is, "May God shine the light of God's face upon you and give you grace." And then the final pasuk is, "May God raise God's face towards you and grant you peace." So even though we can revel in the beauty of these 3 verses, they contain a lot of words that I find difficult to define. First one I mentioned was this idea of blessing. The second word that's difficult to define is chen, which is usually translated as grace or favor. And then the blessing seems to culminate in this apex of what is being asked for, and that is that God raise God's face towards you and grant you peace. Now, the interesting thing about the Hebrew for God raising God's face towards you is it's connected to the title of our Parsha, NASSO. It's the same verb. So what does it mean for God to raise God's face towards you? We're going to explore that a little bit too. And right before this blessing is given, we read that God instructs Moshe to speak these words to Aaron and his sons, literally teach them, so that they can give this blessing to the people. The interesting thing about this is that out of all the rules and mitzvot and laws that pertain to the rituals having to do with the temple service, this is the only vestige of those rules that we continue to perform. And in fact, there's a custom in the home on Friday night for parents to bless their children with this blessing. Rabbis bless the congregation with this blessing. So the blessing is very, very familiar to us, but literally the only part of the temple service that we continue to perform and recite today. So what is a blessing? And what does it mean to give or receive a blessing? So let's go all the way back to the first blessing that was given in Torah, and that can give us some clues about what it means. This is way back in Bereshit, after God has created Ha'adam, who was created in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. That's way back from chapter 1 in Bereshit. And then immediately we read, after the creation of Ha'adam, that God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So we get a clue into the meaning of blessing from God's own words, be fruitful and multiply. It seems that the first blessing is about having children, perpetuating ourselves, increasing our number. So our sages teach us that blessing in general is about increase, not just about increase in terms of fertility, but about increase in joy, in peace, prosperity, even material things, increase in learning, increase in goodness, and ultimately increase in holiness. And that blessings are not just something that we wait for or wish for, they surround us every day of our lives. I want to read a quote from Dr. Nathan Lopez Cardozo. You may know the name Cardozo. It's a very prominent name in legal circles. There's a university named after Justice Cardozo. He was a Supreme Court Justice of the state of New York. But they also have a branch in the Cardozo family that were prominent Jews and rabbis. So this particular rabbi, Nathan Lopez Cardozo, said, how wise were the sages of Israel when they instituted the custom of making a blessing on almost anything, whether it is eating, drinking, observing natural phenomena, or smelling extravagant aromas. They depicted all these activities as nothing less than totally miraculous. Such a beautiful quotation to me, because of course, what I need to be aware of at all times is just how grateful I am for everything that surrounds me and everything that has been given to me and everything that I get to enjoy, all of God's blessings. So keep that in mind, the idea of gratitude. So let's go a little further into the priestly blessing. For those of us who have been members of Or HaTorah for a long time, and we're used to going in person for many, many years, we're very familiar with this red Siddur. It's the Siddur Hadash. We used it weekly in synagogue. But since the page that I'm interested in wasn't really part of the Saturday morning service, I found it, and I want to share some of it with you. Part of this, what I'm going to read, has a prominent feature in the morning blessings. But most of us, we skimmed right through to get to the parts of the service that we chanted together with the congregation. So on page 21, and if you have this Siddur, you can open it up, but if not, I'm going to read the important parts. But on page 21, it also gives us the Birkat Kohanim. And then right after that, it quotes a passage from the Mishnah. The Mishnah, as you know, is the commentary on the Torah. And then right after that, there's a paragraph that is quoted from the Talmud. So let me get the sequence here so everybody knows. First, there's the quotation from the Tanakh, from Torah, which is the Birkat Kohanim. Next, there is a quotation from the Mishnah, which is a commentary on those verses, the 3 verses, which is the priestly blessing. And then after that is the commentary from the Talmud. Now, the Talmud is comprised of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah plus the Gemara is the Talmud. So that's the sequence. Think of the Torah at the core, then the first commentary, the Mishnah, outside of that, and then the next commentary is the Gemara outside of that. So that's the sequence here. And even though it doesn't say in the Siddur that these 3 things are linked, I'm going to show you why I think they are and why it's an important clue about what this priestly blessing really means. So the first quotation is from the Mishnah, and it's from Peah, which means corner, as in corner of the fields. So you'll be familiar with the mitzvah about not harvesting all the way to the corner of the fields. They don't belong to the farmer who owns the field. They belong to the poor and to the widow and to the orphan and to the stranger. So literally, the fact that these parts of a person's land is taken away from them in terms of the food that's growing on them doesn't make it a charitable donation to those people, because they're not really the owners of what's growing on that part of the land. It's really beautiful. It's a way for those who need to come and pick up the produce to not feel like they are less than, and this is merely a charitable donation. They are coming onto the land and taking what God says is set aside for them. It belongs to them. So this is from Peah, corner, and I'll read. The following are commandments for which there is no prescribed measure: the crops on the border of the field to be left for the poor and the stranger, the gift of the first fruits, the pilgrimage offerings brought to the ancient temple on the festivals, deeds of loving kindness, and the study of Torah. So that's how the Mishnah expands the priestly blessing. Now, the next paragraph is how the Talmud expands the priestly blessing. In fulfilling the following commandments, one enjoys the yield in this world, while the principle remains for all eternity: honoring mother and father, performing deeds of loving kindness, punctually attending the house of study morning and evening, showing hospitality to strangers, visiting the sick, helping the needy bride, attending the dead, praying with devotion, and making peace between individuals. And the merit of study, the merit of Torah study, is equal to all of these. And that's from the tractate in the Talmud, from Shabbat 127a. So at first glance, we may think, what's the relationship between this Mishnah and this Talmud to the priestly blessing? So I'm going to try to make that clear for us, because I believe that they give us a roadmap, a way for us to be worthy recipients of the blessings that are described in the priestly blessing. We all want to receive God's blessings and to feel an awareness of God's presence and of God's protection. We also want the intimacy that is implied in the image of God being so close to us that we bask in the light that emits from God's metaphorical face. It's a beautiful image in the second line of the priestly blessing. Embedded in this experience is a promise that we can be like Moshe. And why do I say that? Because out of everyone that is described in Torah, obviously Moshe is unique. He had a face-to-face experience with God. He had intimate conversations with God. He had a unique relationship. And I think by way of this blessing, we're supposed to understand that we too can have this type of relationship with God, this level of intimacy, this face-to-face experience, what Martin Buber describes as an I vow experience, and I'll go into that a little more later. In fact, I think God is yearning for this, and we can find that our soul yearns for that as well. And I think that peace, which is mentioned in the third line of the priestly blessing, peace is found when we feel God's immediate presence. And I think also peace is found in the performance of the acts that are described in this Mishnah and in this Talmud section. So it's a circular experience with one act feeding into another, and I'll explain what I mean. The three lines of the priestly blessing seem to be building up to this ultimate reward, which is the blessing of peace, shalom, which also shares a root with the Hebrew word shalem, which means wholeness. By performing the acts that I just read about in this little section from the Mishnah and the Talmud, we invite God into our lives and invite God's blessings, protection, grace, and ultimately peace. So how do we invite these blessings into our lives and literally into our souls, and also into the lives and souls of our loved ones? So let's take apart this Mishnah a little bit. The first indication of how to invite God's blessings into our lives is to be generous to those less fortunate and enable them to share in our good fortune without calling attention to ourselves or taking credit, so that they can take with dignity. Like I said, the corners of the fields don't belong to the farmer, don't belong to the owner of the land. They belong to the people that come and take from it. We give from our first fruits, knowing and acknowledging that everything is from God, regardless of our labors. That's the next item mentioned in the Mishnah, the first fruits. These first fruits belong to the Kohanim and the Leviim, who are not given a heritage in the land of Israel. So just imagine, they have no means to grow their own food. They're therefore dependent on us for this food, but ultimately this food belongs to them. So the first fruits that are brought belong to the Kohanim and the Leviim. The next thing that's mentioned in the Mishnah is the pilgrimage festivals. So we know that 3 times a year, Jewish men are required to bring pilgrimage offerings from the 3 harvest times to the temple: on Pesach, which is the barley harvest in spring; on Shavuot, which we just had, which is the wheat harvest in summer; and on Sukkot. And specifically, the 8th day of Sukkot marks the conclusion of the harvest time for fruits, and that's in autumn. We're taught that Jewish men shall not appear empty-handed when they show up in Jerusalem for these 3 festivals. Each shall bring his own gift, and I'm quoting from Deuteronomy here, appropriate to the blessing which the Lord your God has given you. So literally, these 3 pilgrimage is taking the bounty of the harvest that you have just reaped, carrying it with you to Jerusalem. And there's even a provision that if you can't carry it, or if it's too far, or you don't have the means, that you can sell it for money and then bring that to Jerusalem and then buy things there. But the whole thing is, and just imagine this is like a giant reunion 3 times a year for all the Jews who are scattered everywhere in the world. It's a community building event, an opportunity for all these Jews to come together in Israel, no matter where they live. And what happens as a result of this? It strengthens self-identification of the nation as a religious community, and also confirms the holiness that is associated with Jerusalem. And it reminds Bnei Yisrael, no matter where they are in the diaspora, that the temple was central to the religious consciousness of the people. So not only do we get to eat together with our fellow pilgrims, but once again, we make sure that the Leviim, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow among us can come and eat to satiety. So how do we know that that's part of what we do when we bring these offerings 3 times a year? I'll read from Deuteronomy. Then the Levite, who has no hereditary portion as you have, and the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your settlements shall come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the enterprises you undertake. So there's a promise of blessing associated with this as well. So the next thing that is mentioned in the Mishnah, as far as what we need to do in order to be worthy of receiving the blessings in the priestly blessing, we're told that there are things that have no prescribed measure. That means that it's not subject to any law of maximum. So why is that important? Because we're told to perform acts of loving kindness, which we know as gemilut chasadim. Those are the acts that are beyond the requirement of justice, beyond measure for measure, beyond any debt that we may owe. Our minimum requirement of adhering to the letter of the law, to justice, gives way to a generous heart here. When we go beyond what is minimally required, we pass through the realm of justice into the realm of righteousness. And when we go beyond even righteousness is when we find ourselves in a holy space shared by God. The very nature of acts of loving kindness is about going beyond. Finally, this paragraph from the Mishnah ends with the obligation to study Torah. Why? Because in our study and immersion in words of Torah, we understand that all good increases. And in the studying of Torah and the doing of Torah, walking with God, we see the infusion of blessing and holiness in everything that we do and say. So that is the paragraph from the Mishnah trying to explain the priestly blessing and how we can take it into ourselves and do things practical in our daily lives. The next paragraph on this page from the Siddur is from the Talmud, and it expands all these concepts even further about inviting blessing and being a blessing. The description, however, is more specific. We're given an even more detailed roadmap of what to do. So to me, that means holiness is in the details. The first one is honor father and mother, then perform deeds of loving kindness, which we've already talked about. Attend the house of study morning and night. Be like Avraham and show hospitality to strangers, helping those who are less fortunate and in greater need by visiting the sick, who are apt to feel lonely and need a happy distraction. Financially helping the needy bride so that she can feel special and beautiful on such an important day. Attending to the dead who cannot repay or acknowledge our kindness, as well as taking care of the ones left behind and the vacuum that's felt after someone important does pass away. Spending time with the family members and friends who are sad and desolate and need to be surrounded by the love and care of friends and family. We are instructed also to pray with devotion because that kavanah, that intention can lead us to an experience of God beyond what we can explain in words. And that experience is what God wants from us. God wants us to be God knowers, just as we want to be known. This is more of what I referred to before as the I-thou relationship that Martin Buber describes so well. And then finally, understanding that making peace between people is one of the greatest gifts, creating shalom bayit, peace in the house, so that people can find joy with those who surround them. Finally, again, as with the closing phrase of the Mishnah, the Talmud teaches us that the merit of Torah study is equal to all of these. Why? Because everything is in it, and everything is a subset of Torah, which brings us back and explains the heading at the top of the page, it's page 21 in the Siddur, which is called A Heritage of Torah. But perhaps the greatest human expression of being created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, is our ability to confer blessing. And that is what each one of us does when we give this blessing over our children or over our friends. It is appropriate that this is the one law, the one vestige from the temple service that we all participate in regularly. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was, where does this idea of blessing originate? This specific idea of blessing, the blessing of God watching over, of God blessing you, of God shining the light of God's face and giving you grace, and of God turning God's face, literally lifting God's face towards you. So interestingly enough, when we go back to the story of Yaakov, and more specifically, the story of Yaakov and Esav, we know that right after the whole deception that took place between Yaakov and Esav, that Rivka sent Yaakov off because she was worried that Esav would make good on his promise to kill Yaakov. So Yaakov takes off, goes towards the land of his uncle, and he lies down to sleep and has the famous dream, the dream including Yaakov's ladder. This is back in Breshit. And during that dream, God makes a promise to Yaakov, and I want you to see if you can see the echoes of the priestly blessing in the promises that God makes to Yaakov. So Yaakov was in the middle of his dream, and God speaks to him in the dream and says, "Behold, I am with you. I will guard you wherever you go, and I will return you to this soil, for I will not forsake you until I will have done what I have spoken about you." God also tells him, "I am Hashem, God of Abraham, your father, and God of Yitzchak. The ground upon which you are lying, to you will I give it, and to your descendants. Your offspring shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out powerfully." And it continues on a bit. So we recognize that there are words of blessing in this, and also a promise that God makes to watch over Yaakov. Now, when Yaakov wakes up, it seems that he makes a vow back to God that includes these promises that God made to him. So we continue on in the same Parsha. When Yaakov wakes up, he says, "If God will be with me, will guard me on the way I am going, will give me bread to eat and clothes to wear, and I return in peace to my father's house, and Hashem will be a God to me, then the stone which I have set up as a pillar shall become a house of God, and whatever you will give me, I shall repeatedly tithe to you." So it's very interesting. It almost looks like on the surface that Yaakov is merely repeating back the promises that God made to him. But we'll see that there's one key addition that Yaakov adds, and that key addition is, "If God will return me in peace to my father's house." So we'll see that the third line of the priestly blessing includes the wish that God grant you peace. So all of these things that Yaakov is asking for seem to be embodied in the priestly blessing, and specifically this addition, which is the apex of the prayer, of being a recipient of peace. I think that's important because you can have everything that you wish for, but if you don't have peace in your life, it's as if you have nothing. When we read about the blessings and curses, and specifically the curses, one of the most frightening ones is that you will feel pursued, but no one is pursuing you. You will have anxiety and depression, even though everything is going okay in your life. So the whole idea of having everything that you want and need, but not having peace, I think is a real important concept here. And we learn this from the addition that Yaakov made to God's promise when he's fleeing from Esav and going towards his uncle's house. For that reason, there's a new interpretation to think about with the priestly blessing. It seems to be a blessing of reconciliation. And why do I say that? Because here we are in the middle of the Jacob story, and he's just had this dramatic encounter with his brother and also with his father that really had at the core of it a deception. And we know when he meets up with Esav, he is very apprehensive that Esav will still have a lot of animosity towards him, may even try to kill him. That is his fear. And we know that he has this at the back of his mind because when he has his particular encounter in the middle of the night, and he wrestles with this Ish, this indefinite being that we don't know who it is, that he says to the indefinite being, I want you to bless me. So there's an acknowledgement there that Yaakov has received his blessing from his father, not in an upright way, through deception, but now he wants the real blessing. Now he wants it to be sincere with all the cards on the table. So for all of us who feel estranged or alienated, or maybe don't feel God's presence in our lives, the reason why I say that the priestly blessing is a blessing of reconciliation, there seems to be embedded in it this idea that I haven't been totally honest and forthright with everything that I have done and said in my life. And sometimes I feel far away from God's presence. But I want to acknowledge that now, and I want to be closer. I want to be so close that I can experience God lifting God's face to me, such a personal, intimate image. So if we take this blessing and put it in the context of everything that Yaakov went through, both with his father and with his brother, then I think it gives us just a new depth of meaning. And I wanted to share that with all of you today. So I've said